125 people joined already. I suspect we'll have a few more as well. So please just keep yourselves on mute. Questions, let's get the questions through Teams chat if possible, please. It just allows for some good continuity. We've also allocated some time at the end of the session for a more traditional Q&A as well, but I'll be monitoring the chat, so please pop your questions in there as we go through the session. Just a reminder that the LMA Charter, the Misconduct and the RUA principles apply to this session. So in short, please be respectful of your fellow delegates, allow others the time and the place to offer up views, opinions and discussion as well. So let's move on to the next slide. What are we here today to talk about? So let's talk about the background. So first of all, a little bit on the history or the background to the roadmap for the non-financial misconduct journey, looking back a little bit in terms of some of that initial work that happened 3 or 4 years or so ago. More specifically, the session is really designed to look at that updated guidance that came from the FSA in December last year. And as we do that, we'll run through, what have been some of the lessons learned from a banking perspective. So if you recall, the FCA guidance sort of brought the insurance sector, or the non-banking sector, I think it was more correctly referred to, in line with the banking sector. So evidently they're a little bit further down the journey. So we've got an opportunity to hear from an organisation about what are the lessons learned from the banking sector, and how is some of this data captured? How is some of that data used for reporting purposes and to help decision making? And as I said, we've got a Q&A at the end. This session follows a series of 6 sessions that LIBA, RUA and LMA, put on last year. And you can see there's a link to view those sessions should you wish to look at the recordings or look at some of the slides as well. So it's a follow-on to that. Okay, let's move on. In terms of our speakers, very pleased and delighted to welcome EY. So I can't even say Alex R and Alex R because they're both Alex R's. But Alex and Alex from the Regulatory Insights team from EY will take us through the first sort of 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be joined by Sandra Healy from Inclusio, where we'll look at that banking case study and talk about some of the great work that they've been doing as well. So welcome again. Thank you so much for joining. And with that, Alex, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's cliche to say delighted to be here, but indeed I think this is such an interesting topic and such an interesting time with it, and actually, in terms with many regulations have a certain amount of uncertainty of how they're applied and how they're used. I think this is an absolute classic case of that. So really great to be here today talking about it. Just introduce myself. I'm a director in our Regulatory Insights practice. Our Regulatory Insights practice looks across at what's happening in regulation across the country and just starts to try and help firms and indeed our internal people understand where regulators are and where their regulations are going. My background prior to EY was actually at the regulator, leading regulatory policy at the FCA for the best part of a decade. So, again, lots of insight from that sort of side. As Matthew mentioned, questions in the sidebar, and just to note before I introduce Alex, other Alex, we're not going to comment today on individual cases. Lots of stuff goes on in businesses that's not for us today. Today we're going to very much focused on that high level. How might the regulations apply? How have they been applied in banking, and how they work at that kind of more generic level? Alex, just quickly, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, hi everyone. As Alex said, delighted to be here today. I'm Alex Ray. I am in the Regulatory Insights team here at EY as a senior consultant. As Alex said, helping firms navigate regulatory challenges and changing regulation. I joined EY in October. Prior to that, my background was I was at Lloyd's of London for 4 years, mostly working in the policy team, trying to influence upcoming regulation, including on non-financial misconduct, what is an area that I worked on when I was at Lloyd's. I also spent some time at Lloyd's Insurance Company in Brussels as a corporate and legal officer. I'm very happy to be here today.
Thanks, Alex. Right, if we could just move on, I think quickly there's a quick disclaimer, which we like to have. And again, this is any views of third parties and not necessarily the views of EY. And material today has been very much provided for general information, education, and should not be relied on for your detailed legal or professional advice. So obvious stuff there. Next slide, please. And look, agenda-wise, as kind of outlined, we're going to quickly deep dive into the rules and the guidance, and then we'll kind of broaden out a bit into how the regulator sees this fitting with the kind of broader regulatory requirements before getting onto those learnings. And then finally, hopefully some takeaways on how firms should prepare. So with that, I'll pass over to Alex, who's going to take us through the first part of this. And next slide.
Thanks very much, Alex. Yeah, if we could just flip to the next slide, thank you. So we thought it'd be helpful to start with a bit of a timeline of events that have led us to where we are now. So back in September 2023, both the FCA and the PRA published separate, albeit very similar, consultations to address diversity and inclusion in the financial services. There were far-reaching proposals on collecting, reporting, disclosing certain D&I data, the requirements to establish and maintain a D&I strategy, and also setting appropriate D&I targets. Alongside this, we also saw the early proposals from the FCA about better integrating non-financial misconduct into staff fitness and proprietary assessments and the conduct rules, which is what we're going to talk about obviously later on in this session. Shortly after these consultations closed, Treasury Select Committee published their 6th Sexism in the City report. As part of the inquiry, the MPs were exploring the role of the government and regulators should play in combating sexual harassment and misogyny in financial services and examining the barriers faced by women. In the report, the MPs said that they were very supportive of the regulators' proposals to strengthen the non-financial misconduct regimes, and the regulators came back and committed to prioritising this work. Later emerged in March 2025 that for a variety of reasons, it was only the non-financial misconduct proposals that were going to be taken forward from CP 2320. So at that point, kind of dropping the other proposals with regards to the targets and the strategy. So in the background of all of this, the results of the FCA's non-financial misconduct survey of wholesale financial services firms was taking place. And in the years covered, which was 2021, 22 and 23, they found that bullying and harassment was the most recorded concern. And the findings, which we'll cover later, you can also access yourselves, and it should help firms to benchmark themselves against their peers within their own sector, but also against other areas of wholesale financial services. Later in the year, the new rules were finalised last year, and following requests for further guidance from both banks and non-banks, the FCA published their guidance in December 2025. The new rules, which we'll dive into just now, come into force later this year in September. So if we can flip to the next slide, thank you. So what's the new rules? So the new rules basically expands the scope of the COCON in non-banks to align with banks for non-financial misconduct. Ultimately, this means that cases of non-financial misconduct like bullying, harassment, violence towards colleagues, which violates their dignity or creates an offensive environment, will be a matter of regulatory concern for both banks and non-banks. So for non-banks, i.e. insurers, brokers, conduct rules until now have only applied to behaviour related to financial services work. But this is changing. So under the new COCON rules, bullying, harassment, similar behaviour between colleagues will fall within conduct rules, even if it happens outside someone's strict financial services role. Also, the same cases of non-financial misconduct is going to be an explicit factor in fitness and proprietary assessments. So the FCA has produced guidance to support all firms in scope of these rules in determining whether behaviour constitutes a breach of COCON or F&P. This guidance will support not only those newly brought into scope, such as insurance companies, but also support banks who have been subject to this for longer, who have been asking for that further guidance. So if we could flick on to the next slide, we can have a little bit of a look at that guidance. So the FCA is really clear that firms will still need to use their judgment when assessing misconduct cases. The guidance doesn't list every single kind of misconduct and every kind of situation, but it's designed to give firms support in reaching these judgments. Although, as we're going to discuss later, you'll see that some cases will be clearer than others. So looking at the slides here, you can see that conduct falls under COCON rules if either person, victim or perpetrator is involved in work-related behaviour works on the financial services side, then the behaviour's in scope. But if both people are entirely outside of the financial services part of the business, then the behaviour's out of scope. And this is designed to make sure poor behaviour in mixed teams doesn't fall through the cracks. So either one is involved in financial services business of the firm, then the conduct can be within scope. Also see that in the final guidance, the FCA's clarified that the behaviour must have either the purpose or the effect of, violating an individual's dignity, creating intimidating environment, degrading, humiliating, offensive, anything along those lines. It's the purpose or the effect. So if somebody were to send a hostile email, for example, and it gets intercepted before it reaches the intended recipient, then it could still be within scope, even if that recipient hasn't actually opened the email themselves. And for fit and proper, and for fit, in the consultation phase, respondents were quite concerned about the potential for, how much firms would be required to monitor private lives, act to this big brother figure, potentially have, whether the requirements would be so much that they would be breaching privacy laws. The FCA's clarified that this is not the case. There's not the expectation of monitoring private lives, but if something comes to the firm's attention that they could reasonably know about, then even if that's in private life, then they need to consider whether it has a material risk of breaching standards or undermining public confidence. And they need to consider this in fit. But it's not a case of being a big brother and watching every step of everyone's private life, investigating kind of trivial or implausible allegations. We'll flick on to the next slide and I'll pass across to Alex to take over.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Now, if we could move on to the next slide again. So, I mean, really in practice, what we're seeing here as we extend this non-financial misconduct in COCON to insurers is really the kind of wider view of the regulator at the moment of trying to actually focus on outcomes and actually truly trying to make sure that they as a regulator have all the tools necessary to get at that. So when we're thinking about non-financial misconduct, really what we're thinking about is how the conduct of individuals within the firm spills over to practice and therefore consumer outcomes and the way the business runs. And this is really important within this outcomes focused environment. So what you see here actually when we put it together is there's a whole range of different regulations that fit together and actually really indicate how the regulator is looking at the problem here. Now, the first one, which we've been talking about for a number of years now, consumer duty that we put out here. Now, consumer duty is both important for those where it directly applies, so for retail customers, but also more important, I think, for a kind of sense of culturally from an FCA perspective, how they're applying regulation and their approach to regulations across the business. So when you move to a consumer duty world, really what the regulator's doing is they're saying they're starting to focus much more on those end outcomes to customers rather than the process by which firms look at their compliance. So when we look at that end outcomes, that means the regulators started to move to a world where they're actually thinking about what's the MI, what's the data that we can actually look at that helps us say whether the results of the business align with the intent and can firms actually really articulate the intent they're running to. So I think this is really important because that intent point starts to get at why they then start to move much more into non-financial misconduct. So actually, how's the business being run and how does that apply generally? The second part we then look across is, of course, the senior manager's certification regime. Now, this fits in as a really important thing because, in part, this becomes the mechanism by which the non-financial misconduct becomes the obligation. So, in effect, when you start to put individuals as being responsible for aspects of the business, they also then become responsible for the way in which the business is run within this area. So the SMCR then starts to put individuals on the hook. So when the non-financial misconduct may occur, we can look at individuals and start to say, actually, this is the individual that is responsible for ensuring that climate wasn't there in the firm. So again, the SMCR will be really important in the way this is implemented. Now, of course, moving across the cultural expectations here, as we've had for a number of years, the regulator being really quite interested in actually tackling bullying, harassment, and actually been starting to look for a number of years about what is it about the way the firm runs that actually impacts on the outcomes for customers. Now, what you see with the NFM here is we started then solidify that into COCON. So those rules are really concrete, and it's really clear from a firm perspective how the regulator might start to think about this issue. So that's that cultural expectation that goes alongside that. And as you see that the non-financial misconduct rules and guidance sit along underpinning all these areas and allow the regulators to have a much wider set of tools when they're looking at these issues. But of course, these main tools are also themselves supported by lots of other aspects. And the one I'd particularly call out at this point is the whistleblowing. And we've seen that as particularly important and often a failing within firms of actually making sure there is a very clear whistleblowing policy, clear training for staff, and clear ways for staff to actually enter the whistleblowing process. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, as they're increasing their emphasis on non-financial misconduct, that puts increasing emphasis on the way in which firms are picking up, identifying the problems that are emerging. And so whistleblowing moves right to the top of the way that firms operate. And then if we look for far right here on the governance and CISC rules, of course, they're really essential here as well, because it's the way in which the firm processes the information it receives and manages all these risks in a way that feeds information up through the business to the board. And where those aren't working well, we increasingly see problems in firms. And it's probably worth reflecting on a couple of examples at this point. They're actually out there in the public today. Now, of course, the first example I wanted to focus on is very much still in kind of appeals at the moment at the upper tribunal, but I think it kind of starts to get at how the regulator looks at some of this. So again, there was an example, I think, in a firm a year or two ago where there was a sexual harassment allegation about the individual who'd been the allegation had been against had received a final warning, and apparently they breached the terms subject the accusation, breached the terms of the warning. Now, I think the really interesting thing here in terms of the way the regulator's gone after this case is actually the individual themselves allegedly obstructed the process, postponing meetings, changing who they're reporting to. Now, the FCA then, in looking at this problem, what they actually did was they fined the individual and banned them from the UK financial services. And they did this for a lack of integrity in their actions, disrupting the disciplinary process. So again, what you're seeing there really is the FCA thinking through all of the rules it has and all the ability it has to get after the behaviour that it thinks could lead to poor conduct. Now, why are they interested in this, of course, is because that sort of conduct can undermine the operational effectiveness of the business. It stops people actually having those open and honest conversations. So again, the non-financial misconduct can directly lead through to poor customer outcomes. Now, another example probably worth just quickly, focusing on was one that was much more public, a few years back when there was a person from the asset management firm who was evading train fares and knowingly broke the law. Now, they knowing it was in the press, they've been caught, they've been fined by the train company, but the FCA, when they found about it, actually they looked at this and they considered that the individual lacked honesty and integrity, and so didn't actually meet the approved persons test. And so the individual themselves was banned from performing any function in relation to regulated activities. Now, what's a good lesson from this, of course, is that, firms aren't obliged to monitor private lives. Behavior in private lives, though, can be considered where it creates material probability of breaching regulatory standards, undermining public confidence. So in that case, the recent FIT clarifications mean the firm would need these actions in the F&P assessment if they're aware of it. So again, I think that's a kind of quite a useful example there. So let's move on and then think about what lessons we can draw from the banking sector on this. So next slide, please. Yeah. So, the guidance we're seeing here, it brings a lot of clarity, but I think it does leave some genuine challenges remaining for firms. And as we now noted here, we'll unpack this in a second, which I think is the really important one. What is that boundary between work and private life? And I think there is a reasonably good frame of way of looking at this. So we'll look at that in a second. But this is really requiring firms to carefully balance the regulatory expectations, the employment law considerations, and the organizational policies. And as Alex will unpack it in a bit later, there's lots of actions that firms will need to take about this. But this challenge here is particularly difficult when it's at that edge of work and private life. So, for example, as Alex mentioned, if it's in a bar where colleagues have a drink between work and a work-related event. But what this is going to require from firms is an exercising judgment. So that the FCA are not giving you clear guidance that tells you what to do in every single case. So the management of firms will need the kind of organizational policies, but also an ability, a muscle within the firm that allows them to exercise judgment of when they think this tips over into activities that actually sit within a regulatory framework. And that manager accountability, which we see through the SMCR regime, requires that reasonable steps mindset. Now, what that means is, of course, is that you have to think, what would a reasonable person expect from your firm? What would they expect you to take as action? And so very much cases when you see the more obvious cases, you see actions within a firm, it would reasonably expect it actually that you should be taking action because it impacts on the ability of the firm to function and deliver its key role. Now, the challenge for firms, of course, in all of this is both embedding that within their frameworks and decision making, but also calibrating it across business lines to make sure that actually you have equal treatment in different areas of your business. And of course, operationalizing that within expectations, given the expected scrutiny from firms and regulators and wider industry, is of course going to be quite challenging. And again, you have to put this in within a consumer duty mindset of the regulators today, which is one that very much focuses on that top down. What's the MI you're collecting? How are you using that to evidence what you're doing? So, of course, that, of course, leads to this question of how do you ensure fairness and consistency, which I think will be a key issue for firms as they approach this. But let's move on to the next slide and just dip into how we can navigate the kind of work and private life boundaries. Now, we see here in the way the regulators approach this, that very much we see it split up into the three sections. What's generally in scope, what's that grey zone, and what could you generally look at as out of scope? And the really obvious ones, like, the generally in scope, of course, is the misconduct to a colleague when traveling to a work meeting when they're representing the firm, or in a business meeting, or indeed in a firm organised social occasion, which I think everyone's been aware of for a number of years now, as we've seen kind of changes the way that work social occasions occur. There's a grey zone in this, though, which I think is the really interesting area, where the judgment is really required from firms. And that's really kind of if direct reports are feeling obliged to attend an event which isn't strictly a work event. And that brings you into grey area. If something occurs in those sort of events, it could be considered within the boundaries here of this non-financial misconduct. And again, one we've kind of touched on earlier briefly is if the event takes place after a firm event, it could be seen as continuation of that first event and therefore a firm event and therefore within the boundaries here. And one that's increasingly problematic, of course, is the social media post on a personal account. And now, in some cases, that will be seen as within this operation. So not the individual's personal activity, but seen as business activity. So particularly if it's got some reference to the business itself or the work of financial services or indeed colleagues or the business. So again, there's a greyness here that requires firms to really think quite carefully about this. Now, generally out of scope, we see some of the areas which are generally in private life. So, something that happens to a member of public during commute to work or misconduct with a family. But of course, even repeated misconduct in private life can be seen as relevant to fitness and propriety for SMCR roles. If it's repeated at work, it would breach regulatory standards. So again, it's really important here that even in the areas that are generally out of scope, there can be connections that are taken and seen later on. So that's a kind of that broad navigation of the work and private life boundaries. If we can move to the next slide, what are we seeing from banking really, and what are the things that we see there? Let's go to the next slide, please. Can we get the next slide?
So I've moved it on.
It's just slow, is it? Is it me or is it? Anyway, I will start talking to it, and I can't see it at the moment, but that's fine. So first of all, I think really important to get MI and governance in place. And here, I think the FCA have identified that they're seeing gaps in large firms and how the non-financial misconduct oversight and governance is undertaken. So I think it's really important to think about actually what is the formal governance structure or committee that you have in place to decide outcomes and disciplinary action. So that becomes really important, and that sharing of non-financial misconduct related MI with the board or board level committees become really important. So again, here thinking about how you segment the allegations, how you push between proven and unproven, timelines for investigations, and setting actually how that can be done in practice. And indeed then patterns by business area, so the demographic or geography. So again, starting to really think about those aspects of it. So that's your kind of MI and governance side of things that I would look at. Now, the second, then we move on to that much more of the policy, processes and procedures, which I think are really important here. Now, I know that London market insurers tend to have less complete policy frameworks in place for non-financial misconduct. So I think here there's a real scope to be maturing over time and to make sure that we actually deliver something here. So I would really start thinking about developing and embedding whistleblowing policies. Now, I think there's been surveys in the past about 90% of London market insurers had whistleblowing procedures and policies in 2024. These are absolutely essential part of the framework here. So it's really critical that we actually have those whistleblowing procedures and places in place. I think secondly, I think developing and embedding remuneration policies. Now these are, again, really critical part of having that sort of place. So here we are on process and procedures. So yeah, and then finally, despite it being kind of much more, I guess, on the backbone of the regulators, thinking about that development of discrimination and D&I policies to make sure that insurers really get themselves, aligned with banks in that approach. And certainly from a banking perspective, the processes and procedures have been absolutely critical. Detection, of course, again, we've spoken earlier. I spoke about the difficulty of the grey zone and where we are. So actually having in place an ability to detect where issues are sort of, are need to be improved, I think is really important. Now, certainly in the past, I know London market insurers have relied heavily on grievances to detect non-financial misconduct. Like banks themselves, they tend to have a more mature detection methods and are looking much more broadly at how they identify this. So this could be monitoring and surveillance tools. So actually, how are people looking at work communications, but also more broadly thinking about that kind of to what extent they're looking at social media. And then, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, whistleblowing policies are absolutely critical part of how firms actually identify and detect the non-financial misconduct. And finally, I think, confidentiality agreements. And we've seen, certainly following the introduction of these rules in the banking sector, that wholesale banks really reduced the use of non-disclosure agreements. And indeed, the Treasury Select Committee themselves I'd raised concerns about their misuse to silence victims and protect perpetrators. So that's an area I think the banks have had to very quickly learn from and increase their protections for. Now, insurers themselves, I think the lesson here is they should also look at actually reducing their reliance on non-disclosure agreements. An outcome of non-financial misconduct cases should be really out there to learn from, and any agreement needs to have clear carve-outs for disclosures to regulators and law enforcement where they are put in place to make sure that actually the information flows are really good there and allow people to actually really learn from here and also disclose what needs to be disclosed to the regulator. And I think this is a critical part, of course, because the regulator expects firms to be clear about their cases they've had and how they've handled them. So I'm going to hand back to Alex now. She's going to talk a bit more about how firms should prepare in the coming months.
Thanks, Alex. If we could flick to the next slide and the one after that. Thank you. Great. Thank you. So building on what Alex has just said and kind of bringing together everything that we've spoken about thus far today, firms really need to think about the practical next steps. Our overarching message is this isn't just a compliance exercise. Firms need to build the right governance, processes and culture to identify, manage and escalate non-financial misconduct in a way that stands up to regulatory scrutiny, as this is going to be a regulated risk. Before anything else, firms need a clear, up-to-date policy and procedural framework, because this is what everything else is going to hang off. Policies on conduct, whistleblowing, as Alex just mentioned, grievance processes, social media must all consider and reference the new updated expectations and set thresholds, outline the escalation and the reporting pathways. And this documentation provides the backbone and sets the overarching framework and requirements for everything that follows that we're going to discuss on this wheel here. So moving around the wheel, from that foundation, firms can then build the right governance structures to align to that policy and procedural framework. That could mean setting up or even adapting existing committees to oversee non-financial misconduct trends and risks and ensuring that consistency in judgment. With this governance structure in place, obviously it's important that those forums and committees are getting the right management information to make decisions and to see the full picture and to act early, not just be reactive but also proactive. So that management information needs to be robust and reliable. Moving further around, firms need to make sure that people, processes and training are brought up to speed so that employees and managers, SMCR, everyone understands, SMS, all understand the expectations and how to apply them in practice. It's important that to ensure that the workforce is confident in recognising non-financial misconduct when it takes place, knowing when to speak up, again, playing into the whistleblowing that Alex was speaking about earlier, and understanding their responsibilities, because across the firm, people have responsibilities at varying levels. Against this, a strong record-keeping framework is essential for compliance. Auditable logs of decisions, rationales, escalation points are all going to be important when demonstrating action and consistency to the FCA. And then reinforcing all of this and everything that we've spoken about today is culture and communication. Firms need to actively promote psychological safety, consistent messaging from leadership, and speaking up mechanisms so employees feel safe raising concerns. There's no point having all of this in place if no one's going to raise concerns in the first place and make sure this behaviour is identified and subsequently managed. On here, obviously, we've mentioned MI, and although the FCA is not requiring firms to report or collect specific non-financial misconduct data to them, data is still going to be critical for managing misconduct risk. Across the board, we're seeing the FCA shifting towards a continuous data-led supervision model. This is helping them to identify risks earlier, more accurately, and intervene in a more proportionate way. In non-financial misconduct, firms need to use data to understand the risk patterns, inform decisions and escalations, and evidence how non-financial misconduct issues are identified and managed to the FCA and to themselves. So this robust explainable data will help demonstrate, again, to the FCA and to the firm themselves that it understands the risk profile and is meeting these new expectations. And that's kind of what we think of the next steps are going to be for firms. And I think this is where we pass across, unless Alex has anything to add to this last little section.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's just a final thing to note, as Alex has mentioned there, that the regulatory approach on everything now has moved away from one of supervisory touch points that generally tended to mean that large firms saw much more of the regulators to one of kind of much more data-led supervision, and we've seen a significant increase in the impact of this on smaller businesses who increasingly find the regulator understands a lot more of what's going on within their business and is able to actually take action much more freely. So I think in embedding this, it becomes MI, and the way MI is being used is absolutely critical, which I think is a good, hopefully, a lead into the next section of this. So we'll pass back with that.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Sandra Healy. I'm the founder and CEO of Inclusio. And today what I'm going to do is share a case study on data that we've been capturing, helping the brokers benchmark. If there's any questions or anything, please just pop them in the chat. If I was to describe the work that we do in Inclusio, and I will describe it as we work through the slides, but essentially we're a culture risk monitoring platform. We capture data directly from employees, and then we translate that insight into areas where you need to take action and into useful management information then for regulatory reporting. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. There's research out there in the market, and I'm sure some of you have read it over the years, where it talks about 1 in 3 people have left a company in the UK each year due to poor company culture. And this costs the UK economy 23 billion each year. And actually there's data across saying similar things in other parts of the world. So there's no surprise really when we see the regulator focusing on non-financial misconduct and how culture is an integral part of that and culture monitoring. And that's really what we're gonna talk about today. The key thing I'm going to focus on is how can firms generate usable culture management information that supports board oversight and helps them make better decisions. So you can move on to the next slide, please. Yep, sorry, just back to the other one. Yep, that's it. So Inclusio, we're 8 years in existence. We spent 4 years in R&D in a university setting. And one of the things we set out to address was to figure out how can we measure culture. So when we were in the market, we had leaders saying to us, I can't measure culture. If I can't measure it and I can't do it in a credible way, it's not going to be one of my top priorities. So that was one of the first things we set out to achieve, to figure out how can we scientifically measure culture and bring an evidence-based approach to that. Throughout our research, we did a deep dive with 35 global companies. Quite a lot of them actually were financial services firms and insurance firms. And we wanted to understand what were the barriers for employers capturing the data. And what employers were saying to us is, we want to be reflective of our customers and communities. We want to be able to evidence that we have a good culture, but we're finding it really difficult to capture that data directly from employees. When we spoke to the employees in the same companies, what they said to us is, we don't like disclosing personal things about ourselves and having that attached to our HR record. And most of the time, employees were saying to us, we want to be part of the solution. We want to give feedback and we want the culture to be better. Some of the things, for example, we heard is, I don't want my manager to get into trouble, but I want to give the feedback. So we had to try and figure out how could we capture that data in a confidential way and then bring it together through insights that would help leaders make the right decisions around culture. When I think about our culture model, and I'll be talking about that in a couple of minutes, psychological safety was a key component of it. So that was one of the key areas when we looked at and investigated what does a good culture look like. And psychological safety is the absolute foundation of creating that environment where people feel safe to speak up. It's also around innovation. So when you understand deeply around psychological safety, it is around people being able to contribute their ideas and being heard and being valued for their individual contributions as well. So it's not just around speak up, it is around innovation as well. We can move on to the next slide, please. And as I said, we're 8 years at this now, right? So we developed a scientific model and we've standardized that around how we measure culture. So we've 5 metrics, there's 57 indicators, and there's 17 sub-dimensions. And essentially what we do is we capture the data directly from the employees. It's confidential. It allows them to give their feedback in a confidential way around the culture. We also capture data around their individual differences. And some of the information we capture is around marginalization and discrimination and things like that. So it helps us understand what individual groups, how they're experiencing the culture, and if they're having a different experience compared to the general population. Within the model, the scientific model, we measure psychological safety. We also measure trust. So trust in leadership, trust in manager, and trust in my team. And we also measure around manager performance. So we've all heard the saying that people join a company and leave a person, and quite often that can be related to my connection and my experience with my individual manager. So for managing culture and being able to monitor culture, we really need to understand what the individual experience is like for the people right across the organization, no matter where they are, no matter who they report into. And then team dynamics. So we measure belonging, for example, and understand how people feel connected to the culture of the organization. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a case study. So we do a lot of work with financial services firms, and we have done over the years. And we very much aligned the output of Inclusio to be regulator grade data. So we had engaged with LIBA, it was probably mid last year now. And at the time, what we were hearing is that the brokers were not engaging in the Lloyd's culture data capture for many different reasons, probably a lot to do with the size of the organizations. It could be quite a big overhead. And we generally get over 80% completion when we capture the data. So we wanted to test and see if we were to engage with the brokers in LIBA, would we get the same level of completion that we see and we've achieved across some of the other financial services firms. So we set out to do that. We agreed that we would have 8 brokers working through the pilot. And what I'm going to do now is take you through the results of that. And just to say, this is a voluntary case study. It's not mandated or a market-wide requirement. What I wanted to do is just show you the power of using gamification, using that confidential platform in capturing the data that you will need for management information. So we move on to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is take you through the preliminary results. So we have 4 brokers have completed data capture, and we have the other 4 now completing this week. So what I'm going to show you now is the preliminary results around the data that we've captured. And if you want to go on to the next slide now, I can take you through that. So when we run Inclusio, you can see it says 15-day campaign. We capture the data in bite-sized interactions, so 3 to 5 minutes a day over 15 days. And what that allows us to do is capture really deep understanding around people's demographics and individual culture experience. We also do bite-sized learning through that, so we're helping employees build cultural competence while we're capturing the data. And what we found with the brokers, so as I said, 4 and 4 completing, that the average completion rate is around 79%, which is phenomenal to see, right? Because I think it's in around 15% the last time we saw through the Lloyd's survey. We've captured over 17,000 individual questions have been answered. And as I said, that's likely to rise now when the pilot is completed. What we have agreed to do is to produce a management information dashboard that can be used for CEOs, it can be used for the board, and can also be used for the regulator as well. And we plan to produce an impact report then for LIBA around the journey that we've been on in capturing this data and the impact that it's had on the brokers and the employees, in fairness, as well, working in the brokers. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So preliminary results, you can see here to the left there, gender. You can see 43% of people who participated are women, 54% men, and 3% another identity, which I know can be very difficult information to capture. When I look at the LGBT stats, you can see there 3%. If I was to look at we capture data across the wider insurance market, and if I was to give you some sense of the benchmarks, we would see around 5%. So what we're seeing in the brokers is 2% less there. If I think about neurodivergence, it's kind of there or thereabouts is what we see in insurance. We do data capture globally with construction market and the mobile industry and hospitality. And actually what we see is much higher levels of neurodivergence in around kind of 19, 20%. But it's good to see consistency across the insurance market there, around 13, 14% neurodivergent. Disability, 4% disability. What we see in our wider benchmark is 2%. And nationalities, twice the amount of nationalities, 22 versus 42 in this data capture, which is really good to see. If I look at the first generation, you can see 22% of people are the first generation to attend third level. And this is an indication of socioeconomic background. In the wider data, we see that generally tends to be 1 in 3. So what we're seeing in the broker population, and that's 1 in 4. And 6% of people have additional caring responsibilities. Generally, we would see that around 9 to 10% in the wider data. And move on to the next slide, please. So just to show you some of the culture data, so you can see here trust, which is trust in leadership, as I mentioned, and trust in manager. So the benchmark that we see for today is 75. If I was to look at that in the wider insurance market, it's 79. If we look at psychological safety, which does include innovation, you can see it's 76. So it's 3 points lower than what we would see in the wider insurance market. If we look at job supports, which is related to that manager performance, 73, and 2 points less than what we would see in the wider insurance. Well-being, we're seeing at 71. That's 1% less than, or 1 point less than we would see in the wider market. And then belonging is 4 points less at 77 versus 81. It's interesting, we've seen the trend over the past 3 years of well-being and belonging actually has been slightly reducing year on year. If we look at the overall culture performance, preliminary results are 74 versus 77 in the wider insurance industry. And really what this starts to show here is that leaders will have a clear link around culture, being able to link culture signals to talent risk. There's insights there on manager performance and protected groups, which I know is one part of the management information that's required around monitoring for FCA. And firms can begin to build a more trusted and repeatable source of culture insight. If you can move to the next slide, please. One of the questions we asked throughout the data capture was we asked people's perceptions of the Lloyd's culture market. And these were some of the key insights. It was a qualitative data capture, and these were some of the key insights that people brought back. So deeply traditional and relationship-based, highly professional and specialist, commercially competitive, still carrying a legacy of male-dominated norms. But there was a really good sense that culture is gradually evolving, which is really good to see. Move on to the next slide, please. And this is part of the work that we're doing, working with the LIBA brokers. You can see this is a culture management information dashboard. So we have an executive summary. We have some key insights around the different culture metrics. And we also have sector benchmarks, which is a really important part of this project. So if you're, for example, it can be difficult for companies to understand what kind of standard you need to hold yourself to, where when you have information and insight around your peers, and that's essentially what we're able to do now with the sector benchmarks. You can see there's some data there around speak up culture as well, and then we have a heat map around the culture performance. Within the platform, it also gives some insights, it pinpoints the areas of risk, and it also gives leaders insight around what action they need to take, and then it gives them benchmarks and some insights around how they're doing compared to others in the sector. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And why have we undertaken this project? For us, it's really around the concept of all boats rise. Okay, so if we can amplify the voices of people, which is what Inclusio is about, is the measure of your culture and the measure of the sector is what the people say it is. It is around elevating the sector performance and linking that to culture, and then enhancing accountability and regulatory readiness. So as we create sector benchmarks around a scientific model on culture, it allows us then to understand what are the key areas that we need to focus on, what do we need to prioritise. And also in regulatory reporting or any kind of management information, you're able to produce data and insight around sector benchmarks. Next slide, please. So what is effective culture MI? What should it deliver for us? So the first thing is around visibility of culture risk with trends over time, early warning signals to take action. I think that's a really key part of it. The best case scenario is that we understand what's going on in the firm, we understand where it's happening, and we can take action on it before it comes into a regulatory issue. Priorities for leadership actions aligned with governance, that's really important. I think Alex were talking there about making sure that we have all the right policies and practices in place, making sure the right training has taken place, and all of that can be monitored and tracked as part of your management information in Inclusio. Employee insight into culture performance, that's really important. How do we create a consistent cultural experience right across the organisation? And that's essentially what we help you do. So you understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the pain points around where our managers could be doing better. And clear decision useful insight for boards and leaders, again making sure that your efforts are focused on the right action, and then monitor and evidence that action is working, being able to track based on the voices of your employees, being able to track that the work that you're doing is actually having the right impact. Next slide, please. And these are 2 reports. Happy to share them if you think they could be useful. And as I said, we plan to publish a report with the LIBA proof of concept. But this is data we've been capturing. This is 4 years in project now, where we've been capturing data directly from employees, aggregating them with employers in the sector and publishing sector benchmarks. And most of the firms that we work with would use this data for reporting into the regulator. But one of the key areas it does really is helps organizations leave the competition outside the door, come in, focus on how can we make the culture better across our industry? How do we make sure that we're listening to the voices of our people? And our reports and the work that we do around voice helps us do that. So thank you. You can move on to the next slide. Thank you. If you want to hear more or see a demo of the platform in action or a copy of the report, please just reach out to us and I'll be happy to support with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Alex, and Alex as well. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes. If there are any questions, there's nothing on the chat, so I'm happy to open that up to the room. I'll see if there's any virtual hands raised. Nothing in the chat coming through.
Andy, I'm just going to quickly jump in with a point that occurred to me.
Please
Apologies to everyone, that my connection dropped out midway through, so the slide stopped working. So thanks, Andy, for jumping in. I suppose one of the things that Alex was talking about, he had his sort of jigsaw with the consumer duty point, with the announcements made by the regulator in December on consumer duty. Significant portion of the business within our market no longer applies to consumer duty, with the international point we might get down to only about 10%. However, I think the key here is that just because consumer duty isn't going to apply doesn't mean the regulator's not going to be interested in non-financial misconduct. So don't take that as a takeaway. I think was going to be my point. But it's just an indicator, I think, is what Alex was trying to say.
Thanks, John. There's a couple of questions come in. Jackie, I might ask you to comment on the first one. Question from Belinda is, only 4 brokers participated in this survey. What needs to be done to get broker engagement in this? Whether you've got any thoughts or...
Yeah, sure, I can come in on this one. This is a very what we call a limited proof of concept exercise. So what we wanted to do initially, some of the larger broking firms have either participated in the Lloyd's Culture Survey, or, you know, if they're large global firms which may be headquartered outside of the UK, they already have quite sophisticated means of collecting this data already. However, what we found, and you know, this is, I think, probably more particular to LIBA and our members, is that 80% of our membership have 50 or fewer members of staff. We have a huge amount of SME size firms that have particular challenges. Now, some of these challenges are the same regardless of what size firm you are. So I think that the guys were mentioning before about the trust in the process. You know, if you're providing these answers to your own employer, can you really trust the results that are coming back? So that's the reason why we wanted to use a third party, so that we could just provide that comfort around the anonymity We also wanted to do something that was a bit more innovative than somebody having to sit down and spend half an hour answering questions on a Microsoft form field that you can't then save. So Sandra briefly mentioned about the gamification of the platform, which is quite innovative. So people will actually, when you're doing it over a period of time, you're actually answering questions in a way that is almost like a quiz or a game, and sometimes you don't actually realize you're answering those questions. So it's not just the qualitative, but the quantitative data that comes back is much more effective. So what we wanted to do with this POC is to just run it as a sort of exercise, but then take the learnings from that and go, okay, how can we put this out? So it's great that we can, we ran all the workshops last year. It's great that EY have come on and really explained that regulatory landscape and what's required. But sometimes firms need assistance as to what is the solution. If the MI is the big question, then what is out there and what is it we can do? So I don't think it's a case that the brokers don't want to do things. I think there are very specific challenges, and we're actually looking at this not just as LIBA for the London market broking side, but also we're having conversations with BIBA as well to look at the wider UK market. So hopefully that provides a bit of a background to the exercise we're doing.
Thanks, Jackie. And I saw your post as soon as I asked the question, so apologies, we might have gone over that. Cheek has asked a question around 79% completion. Was there a previous metric to compare? Sandra, a number of participants?
Andy, we generally get 80% completion, so that's kind of our benchmark of what we see. I think from the last Lloyd's data capture in the brokers, it was 15%. So we're delighted, obviously, with the 80%. As Jackie mentioned, it's a very unique way how we capture the data. For us, it's around building the trust in the confidentiality with employees. And then we're able to aggregate that then to create the sector benchmark. So 80%, that's 79, 80% is exactly where we would expect it to be at this point, Andy.
Okay, thank you. I'm very mindful of time. I can see there are several more questions that have come in. What I propose is that we take those away, we provide a response to those, and we share those with you when we share the slides and the recording. I know many of us tend to dash from meeting to meeting, and I would rather give that proper consideration than try and cover 4 or 5 questions in less than a minute. So thank you, Alex and Sandra. Thank you very much. Thank you all as well for your time today and for the questions. As I said, we will share the slides and the recording, and we'll also come back to you with these questions in the chat. But thanks again for your time today, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.